Just look at virtually any of our Twitter feeds, Facebook pages, the comments posted after news articles and blog postings, and even around many of our dinner tables. And one thing becomes very, very clear. Our discussions of socially charged issues regularly devolve into a win-lose battle characterized by belligerence and righteous indignation and the need to be right at all costs. In a society where freedom of speech is fundamental to our lived existence, it seems as though many of us have forgotten that our rights also come with responsibilities. And in this case, our responsibility is to foster dialogue and collective understanding rather than defensiveness and aggression. And we can do this by building on the work of scientist and philosopher Daniel Dennett. We can create a communication climate in which people actually want to hear our criticism of their ideas. Now, Stephen Covey, who wrote the famous book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, is famous for having said that most people do not listen with the intent to understand. We listen with the intent to respond. What's interesting about this is that Stephen Covey would recommend that we actually focus on the former at the expense of the latter. But reality suggests that we should really focus on both. The first step of this process of offering criticism to people requires us to restate their perspective. And in order to do that, well, basically, Daniel Dennett says that what we should do is say it in such a way and say it so perfectly, so objectively, so clearly that the person turns to us and says, wow, I wish I had said it that way. In order to do this, we have to engage in active, non-judgmental, informational listening. In other words, we must listen with the explicit goal of trying to understand their intended meaning. And this necessitates that we suspend our judgment and try to resist that rebuttal tendency that Stephen Covey notes in his famous quotation. This is not an easy thing to do. This is why when I talk to my students about this, I encourage them to wear a piece of jewelry, such as this ring, and to touch that whenever they're trying to really focus their concentration on listening. Because when we do listen in this way, we are then able to verify that we understand this person's intended meaning, not our subjective and biased interpretation of it. When we engage in this active listening and then follow it with our reiteration of what the person has said, this then indicates that we are understanding what they're saying and that we are open to their ideas. And this openness makes people feel as though their opinions are valued, even if we disagree with them. This reduces defensiveness and makes them more interested in pursuing further conversation with us. It also suggests that in turn, they will also listen to us with objectivity. As Winston Churchill astutely noted, no two can, in all things, agree. All have some daring singularity. This singularity may prevent us from agreeing on all things, but it is seldom that we can agree on nothing. And so the next step of our process is to articulate those things that we agree with this person on. Although we may disagree with, for instance, that the cutting of funding for arts and social services is perhaps not the best option, we probably all can agree on the fact that our taxes are way too high. So invariably, even if we disagree on something, globally, we can agree on something fundamentally. We can bring up those things. And what we do when we articulate this agreement is we create what is called identification. And identification is this bond where we connect on similar experiences and similar beliefs and values. And there's strong evidence from the fields of communication studies and psychology that, contrary to popular belief, similarity does not breed contempt. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We like to listen to people who are similar to us. And we particularly like to listen to people with whom we agree. So by starting from agreement, we frame our subsequent discussion in terms of collaboration rather than competition. And when we listen to understand the viewpoint of someone with whom we disagree, it's very much like opening a book to their perspective. And as Confucius wrote, you cannot open a book without learning something. And it may seem daunting at first, but our next step in creating this positive communication climate is to reveal the lessons that we have learned through this interaction with this person. Doing so indicates that we're open to new ideas, and particularly this person's ideas. And it also communicates flexibility. For example, in a recent discussion with a colleague about gun regulations, I learned that fewer than 3% of gun deaths in America are due to the use of automatic weapons. Now, I went to verify the evidence of this, and it turns out he's right. So I learned this from someone with whom I completely disagree about guns, and subsequently I've changed my perspective on what we should do in order to combat this problem. Again, we can always learn something from someone, even those with whom we vehemently disagree. As Daniel Dennett contends, it is only once we have fully understood a person's perspective, articulated it fully and completely, noted the things that we agree on, and revealed the lessons that we learn from them, that we have earned the right to offer criticism. If our goal is to get our target to truly listen to and ideally embrace our perspective, we have to communicate it in a way that minimizes face threat, demonstrates empathy, and conveys value for them as a person. One of the best ways to achieve this is to resist the use of what are called superiority messages and instead use what are called equality messages. Messages of superiority are divisive because they encourage us a us versus them mentality, as in the case of, you don't know what you're talking about. In contrast, messages of equality minimize status differences and emphasize inclusiveness, such as, I never thought of it that way, but maybe there's another way to think about it. Likewise, it helps if we replace evaluative messages with those that are descriptive. Evaluative messages express an opinion on the value or worth of another person, whereas descriptive messages, they provide information without passing judgment. So, for example, we could replace an evaluative message such as, this immigration policy is the worst ever proposed by a president, with a descriptive message such as, there might be some opportunity for improvement in our president's immigration policy. Moreover, it is important to remember that our opinions are exactly that. They're opinions. And it will benefit all of us then if we use provisional messages rather than certainty messages. Provisional messages offer ideas in a flexible manner that suggests we're open to discussing them further, where certainty messages suggest that there is absolutely no room for debate. Consider the following messages taken from a class discussion that happened last week. One person said, dude, you're totally wrong. And someone else said, well, what makes you believe that? Is it possible that somehow the source of your evidence is flawed, or maybe biased, or maybe they haven't considered other alternatives? Now, needless to say, you can probably figure out which one created defensiveness. So we just need to consider better ways to say things so that we aren't creating this defensiveness. I also want to point out that there's that old saying that, well, I'm going to paraphrase it, that opinions are like anuses. Everybody has one, and they're often full of feces, okay? If we want others to listen to and embrace our opinions, we must back them up with evidence to support them. And this evidence must come from high quality, relatively objective sources. So the AP, Reuters, The Economist, C-SPAN, those all fit that definition. But things like the Huffington Post, Fox News, Breitbart, Mother Jones, the National Review, Jezebel, they're just too partisan for us to be able to agree on them when we sit on opposite sides of the proverbial fence. And unless we are established expert in a field, we need to make a concerted effort to cite those sources. Anyone who's had a basic course in persuasion and social influence or basic communication knows that that is fundamental to effective debate. So by framing our messages in using these types of messages, we can create a communication climate that nurtures respectful conversation rather than hostile quarreling. But I would be remiss if I didn't address the way in which we deliver it. There's an established, in the field of communication studies and psychology, we know that, we've discovered that, when we use we messages instead of I, you messages, we create a better connection and people are more willing to listen to what we have to say. But we have to also think about our tone of voice and our facial expressions and the gestures that we use because they can either make or break our discussion. It is an established fact that nonverbal communication our nonverbal behavior communicates the most meaning in our interactions. And when nonverbals and verbals are in opposite directions, they contradict, most people believe those nonverbals. So if we deliver our messages in the way that I just described, but we do this in a way that has a tone of contempt or eye-rolling or gesticulating hands, we're sort of defeating the purpose. Over the past several decades, the social sciences have established that humans abide by what is called a norm of reciprocity. It's basically an unwritten rule that people should, in kind, return to what they have received from them. So if we communicate our critique in disrespectful, face-threatening, and aggressive ways, no wonder we have these spirals of defensiveness. But today we have explored ways that we can discuss controversial issues by fostering a communication climate that makes others receptive to that critique. And each and every one of us, regardless of our individual beliefs, values, and perspectives, if each and every one of us makes a concerted effort to utilize these techniques, we can capitalize on that norm of reciprocity and foster empathy and dialogue that will move us toward collective understanding and ultimately improve our society. In the words of Benjamin Franklin, any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, and most fools do. I hope we'll all stop acting so foolishly. Thank you.